stimulatory package going to rail, and you're addressing climate change at the same time.
Yeah, look, I agree, and I think that Brad might have a slightly Philistine approach to it, and that if you're looking at only a cost-benefit analysis, there are some of those longer-term values that you just talked about, Wallace, which is, the contribution to the zero-carbon future. And Chris, I think when I read it, it said that the rail infrastructure was there for trains able to go up to 110 kilometres, but over time they would need to put in new rail so that they could go at 160 kilometres an hour. So it would be an ongoing process of upgrading. And I mean, think back to the picture in Venice of the dolphin in the canal. That whole principle of less cars and trucks on the road and less congestion, I think promoting rail around New Zealand in any way we can is a really positive and future-focused strategy. And I agree with it. We should bring it.
And we'll find out more on whether the rail gauge can be retooled to do tilt trains, actually. But Jeanette says air travel is enjoyable because it provides a service, a ticket and a seat. If train travel was an equal service with Wi-Fi, good coffee, seat allocation and of high quality, I imagine you'd be a fool to drive and pay the costs of parking and risk traffic delay. People would spend a great deal annually on public transport and commuting. Why not make it great? Chris, isn't that a good point? If you really scaled up on a high quality train service, it would be fantastic, wouldn't it?
You do have that level of quality in that service in Europe. One of the things we look at here, and it goes back to what was said just a minute ago by Brad, or a couple of minutes ago, was scale. It's mass transit. Do we actually have the people to make it work? Probably the only area where it was considered briefly was what's called the Golden Triangle between Auckland, Hamilton and Tauranga. So that's where population growth is, that's where there's productivity. It links our two busiest ports, although Napier's not far behind. There is the potential to make it work, but then you've got things like tunnels. You've got the Kaimai Tunnel. Anywhere out of Wellington, our topography is much, much different. The cost to do things, like even just building roads, is tricky here because we're this long, skinny, mountainous, up and down nation with only a few people.
Great comments. Quite a few gauge experts coming through. Narrow gauge turns a tighter corner, which is necessary for our heligeography. Also, wide gauge requires wider tunnels and new bridges, plus station platforms need to be trimmed back. None of this is cheap. So we might come back to gauge. It's very interesting. Quite a bit of interest in rail in New Zealand. Oh, we're going to go out with Prince. Fantastic. And someone says, as a proud millennial, I can't see why people are interested with Prince. Pretentious, boring songs and overrated. Move on. I don't know. Crispy Kai.
Kei te whakaronga mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere nei, Air New Zealand refuses to say how many of its staff have tested positive for COVID-19, amid calls from its own workers for mandatory isolation rules for all crews flying internationally. The government's hammered over the extended lockdown and whether it will push small businesses to the wall. For the first time in history, a barrel of US oil is worth less than nothing. So what does it mean for us? International reports say North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is close to death following surgery last week. Virgin Australia goes into voluntary administration, and the Masterton Food Bank runs dry after a massive rush on demand. Don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook.
RNZ News at 5. No mai, haere mai. Good afternoon, I'm Paul Brennan. Air New Zealand crew on international flights fear they and the public are being put at risk by an exemption that means they're not forced to quarantine when they get home. Yesterday, the airline confirmed staff had to self-isolate after claims some of them had disregarded physical distancing rules during a layover in Vancouver. Documents obtained by Checkpoint show increasing unease among staff about the quarantine exemption. Air New Zealand is currently operating 16 return international services a week, and there'll be more on this story shortly in Checkpoint. General practitioners say they've been denied millions of dollars of COVID-19 funding promised to them. The Medical Association, which represents doctors, says the government promised $22 million to help them with costs, but they've received only half and have been told that they won't be getting the rest. The association's GP representative, Jan White, says it's incredibly disappointing. The Health Minister, David Clark, says GPs have been given $37 million in support and further funding is still being decided. The death of a woman in her 70s has taken the country's COVID-19 death toll to 13. The woman, who had underlying health conditions, was one of 6 St Margaret's Hospital and rest home residents who had been transferred to Waitakere Hospital. The Ministry of Health says there are 5 new confirmed cases today, all linked to existing infections. The opposition leader Simon Bridges says 2 government ministers missed the mark when they fronted the Epidemic Response Committee today. Small Business Minister Stuart Nash and Employment Minister Willie Jackson were both grilled by the committee over what analysis the government had done on the impact of the lockdown on businesses. Neither had any numbers or forecasts of how many businesses or workers would be affected by the 5-day extension to the lockdown. Mr Bridges says it appears no analysis has been done on how to protect small businesses.
I grant that forecasting and scenarios and so on in a very uncertain situation never going to be perfect, but you'd like to think they would at least have tried at some level.
Nationals leader Simon Bridges. President Donald Trump is suspending immigration to the United States. He says the move is necessary to protect their country from what he calls the invisible enemy, COVID-19, and also to protect American jobs. The BBC's Peter Bowes has more.
What the president seems to be suggesting is that he will stop immigration into this country. Clearly more people coming in that might be potentially taking the jobs of Americans for an indefinite period. The president has enthusiastically embraced the many calls around the country, a lot of those calls coming from his supporters to get back to work. In fact, he has expressly said that he believes that some of those people taking to the streets that we've seen over the last few days indeed have a case. But this is going much further.
Peter Bowes reporting. The Director General of Health says the risk of COVID-19 coming through the school gate is very, very low. Some schools and early childhood centres are raising concerns about having to open under Alert Level 3, saying it will be impossible to enforce social distancing. But Ashley Bloomfield says the key will be keeping classroom bubbles, so the amount of contact children have is limited and easily traced.
The advice we've given is designed to keep children and staff, all staff, teachers and other staff at school safe. And it's the same principles that are underlying keeping all work environments safe.
Ashley Bloomfield says he's confident there's no undetected community transmission. The man shot dead by the police in Papatoetoe early yesterday has been named. He was 43-year-old Hitesh Navan Lal of Auckland. 13 people called the police about the behaviour of Mr Lal, who was reported to have been damaging cars and power lines and trying to break into a house. After refusing to drop his weapon and advancing towards an officer, he was fatally shot. Victim support is assisting Mr Lal's family and the officer involved is being supported. It's just after 5:04. Sport this afternoon, Mahi Drysdale admits he's struggling, questioning whether his international rowing career is over. In a blog post on his personal website, the Olympic champion says he's always prided himself on being one of the most mentally strong on the planet, but the COVID-19 lockdown has got to him. Sports editor Stephen Hewson reports.
The 41-year-old Drysdale, who's competed at the past 4 Olympics, says just a couple of weeks ago he was on a high, having come back from a training camp where he felt he'd made huge improvements in his rowing. He was counting down to not only chasing a hat-trick of gold medals in the single scull in Tokyo, but also to retirement, only for the Games to be called off and put back a year. Drysdale says he now lacks all motivation and is questioning if he wants to go to the Games at all, something he's never felt before. While he feels he probably will make it to Tokyo next year, he says he's in no position to make a decision about that yet, but hopes things will become clearer for him over the next few weeks. This is Stephen Hewson.
And that's the news.
the Prime Minister defends a lockdown extension,
If COVID took off here, it could have devastated us.
with experts backing her up.
At the moment, our daily total is mainly people who are detected at the airport, and that's fine. I mean, that means the system's working well.
As health officials weed out the virus.
What we are building the system to is to be able to trace several hundred people on any one day.
All the main players for your lockdown lowdown. Morning reports weekdays from 6 on air and online.
Now the short forecast taking us through to midnight tomorrow, Wednesday, updated about half an hour ago. Northland to Manawatu, that includes Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Mainly fine, high cloud, but some showers in Coromandel today. Areas of morning low cloud or fog tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods, a few showers later today and tomorrow morning. Hortowhenua to Wellington, also Waited Upper, mainly fine but cloudy in the west tomorrow evening. Nelson, Marlborough, Canterbury, Otago and Southland, mainly fine with variable high cloud, however scattered rain in Southland and Otago this evening. A few spots possible in South Canterbury. For Buller, Westland and Fiordland, cloud increasing. Rain developing south of Hokitika today and spreading further north tomorrow before easing. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. A few showers today, mainly fine at the Chathams tomorrow. It's 6.5 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Paul, and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. Air New Zealand is keeping secret the number of its staff infected with COVID-19 amid allegations it's not doing enough to keep its workers safe. The airline's crews who fly internationally continue to be exempt from strict 14-day quarantine rules for people returning to New Zealand from overseas, with the exception of LA flights. Just yesterday, the airline confirmed crew members had been forced to self-isolate after some staff allegedly disregarded physical distancing rules during a layover in Vancouver. Now, documents obtained by Checkpoint show increasing unease and fear among flight crew about the exemption from isolation or quarantine and the risk it poses to both colleagues and the public. It's our single biggest cluster, a wedding in Bluff where COVID-19 has spread to nearly 100 people and killed 2, including the groom's father.
The Ministry of Health is saddened to report 2 further deaths linked to COVID-19. The first individual is a man in his 80s who died at Wellington Public Hospital yesterday. This gentleman had a link to an established cluster.
The cluster's been officially linked to overseas travel. An Air New Zealand flight attendant who just returned from the United States and had already been exposed to coronavirus was at the wedding reception. These are the words of an Air New Zealand employee, revoiced to protect their identity.
On 19 March, NZ5 arrived at Auckland from LAX, on which 3 passengers tested positive for COVID-19. At least 2 crew later tested positive. A crew member from that flight, before testing positive, went down to Bluff to attend a wedding. And now we all know about the Bluff cluster.
To understand how that was even possible, given the serious clampdown on international travellers moving around the country, we need to reverse up a little. Just 4 days earlier, the Prime Minister had announced compulsory 14-day self-isolation for anyone arriving in New Zealand from around the world, excluding the Pacific.
As of midnight Sunday, every person entering New Zealand, including returning New Zealand citizens and residents, will be required to enter self-isolation for 14 days. Everybody.
Despite the clampdown, Air New Zealand crew remained exempt at the time and under earlier isolation rules too, and have largely maintained that exemption throughout this pandemic. Here's Air New Zealand's shareholding minister Grant Robertson just last night. Are Air New Zealand staff who are still flying internationally exempt from the quarantine for 14 days?
As my understanding, Lisa, if that continues to be the case, yes, that exemption was granted at the very, very beginning. It allows our flights to be able to move both people and goods around. Of course, there are very, very few international flights.
Checkpoint can reveal that's despite employees repeatedly raising concerns that the lack of isolation for returning crews was endangering them and other people. A letter sent to Air New Zealand management earlier this month starkly lays out the issue.
An Air New Zealand flight arrived at Auckland from which 3 passengers tested positive for COVID-19, 1 in each class throughout the aircraft. 4 crew later tested positive. Another crew member from that same flight, before testing positive, attended meetings, then embarked on a 4-night tour of duty. One of those meetings was attended by yourself. If the 14-day separation rule was in place, that crew member would have remained in self-isolation at home and would not have placed other members of the community or colleagues at risk of COVID-19.
Ministry of Health guidelines exempt aircrew from 14-day stand-downs between different flights, as long as they appear healthy. But the same letter notes these protocols are minimum guidelines. And Air New Zealand has sufficient surplus crew to accommodate a mandatory 14-day stand-down between flight duties to allow for the virus incubation period.
Any socially responsible business that goes above and beyond these minimum requirements is helping create an environment where social transmission of COVID-19 is reduced. We urge you to implement the recommended 14-day stand-down between duties.
Air New Zealand's response shortly, but this is not the first time the airline had been asked to tighten the rules. This from a March letter from union reps to management.
Regrettably, yesterday we learned that there are now 6 Air New Zealand staff who have tested positive for COVID-19. All of these cases are linked to overseas travel. While we wish to protect these individuals' privacy, it is entirely reasonable to surmise that all cases are cabin crew or pilots. We believe it is time to implement a hard 14-day separation rule between all duties to ensure the risk of crew unintentionally spreading this COVID-19 virus is mitigated.
The letter goes on to say it's almost certain there'll be further crew infections, and the current cases indicate assumptions made by the Ministry of Health around flight crew protocols must be wrong, as crew are still contracting the virus despite following the recommended procedure. Remember, about 40% of coronavirus cases in New Zealand are directly linked to overseas travel.
Rudders check, engine check. You guys ready? Take off. Yeah. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Janie. Kia ora and welcome aboard this Air New Zealand flight. It's important you obey your crew member instructions, placards and illuminated signs.
Air New Zealand is a company that prides itself on its safety messages. But in an email dated March 28, it landed on this response to repeated requests for mandatory isolation for all crew.
We are looking into this. Currently, the advice from our medical team will stand for now. As per the alert level, crew will be required to self-isolate in between duties. Air NZ flight attendants are considered to be essential workers and therefore have dispensation to come to work on the provision they are fully fit for work.
So at level 4, crew are supposed to stay at home between flying jobs. But unlike any other passengers coming to New Zealand from overseas, they can get on another flight with potentially hundreds of other people within the incubation period for the virus. The 2 letters raising these grave concerns were sent after the Bluff wedding on March 21st. But a trail of documents obtained by Checkpoint shows as early as January, questions were being asked about the crew quarantine exemption. It's discussed again in February. The advice remains the same: no quarantine required.
This is your final call, thank you.
Kia ora, welcome.
There's also talk about whether it's still safe to hand out sweets, should headrest covers be changed each flight and TV screens cleaned down too. Here's a sample of the minutes from Air New Zealand.
They had seen someone sneezing into blanket and threw blanket out. Don't have faith in our cleaning of blankets. Should we be putting into biohazard kit?
We only had 16 pairs of gloves on the aircraft. We requested to have more and there were no gloves that they could bring up due to nil stock.
And there's a scramble to source gloves and masks for crew. Back to those minutes.
This is not a burn, but why do we have to be so reactive? All the work we have been doing is fantastic, but why did we not expect a pandemic to occur? Why didn't we plan for our people and with stock, and we are now scrambling?
Here's what the whistleblower told Checkpoint about protective gear.
There were constant supply issues with many flights departing without adequate protection available. Aircrew were also advised on board pandemic resources were not to be used for general protection and sent a stern reminder doing so may result in disciplinary action being taken.
The Ministry of Health guidelines for crew overnighting in other countries include wear a surgical mask if on public transport, avoid sightseeing, shopping and any unnecessary trips to to public places. Remain in the hotel room, including using room service. Maintain physical distance from other crew during layover. But at a March 31st health and safety meeting, questions were being raised about whether Air New Zealand crew were following the rules. Here's the notes attributed to the airline's medical officer.
Contact tracing and reviews we're doing are rigorous to determine whether crew were exposed. We believe they were probably exposed on layovers. MOH guidance for layovers is pretty rigid. Not going out using room service, etc. Suspect that's where the process could be breaking down. Some issues with hotels providing food and requiring crew to go out.
Ministry of Health guidelines to airline crew clearly state any crew not following the layover advice must self-isolate away from their bubble for 14 days on return to New Zealand. The same guidelines say airlines need to monitor the effectiveness of COVID controls, and if risks are identified, the airline should impose additional controls. The issue of layover compliance is raised again on April 3 and is in the minutes from an April 7th meeting.
Issues with crew not adhering to the Ministry of Health Social Responsibilities Bulletin whilst on layovers. How can we assist in delivering this important message?
At the same meeting, it's noted a 14-day separation is being introduced for crew duties to LA due to high community spread. No mention of other destinations though. And questions are being asked about exactly how many Air New Zealand staff have contracted the virus. Here's the transcript of the minutes.
Whilst absolutely respecting crew privacy and without discussing specifics, can we please know how many cruise pilots have tested positive for the virus, how many cruise pilots are requiring hospitalisation, number of recovered?
The short answer from Dr. John Chalkley, Air New Zealand's medical officer: no, because of the need to preserve the privacy of a vulnerable group of employees. That's despite others arguing the information could help change crew behaviour and heighten awareness. An Air New Zealand worker whose words are spoken by someone else says the information is key to assessing the risk they're exposed to.
It is clear that the numbers of crew infected has become embarrassing for the Air New Zealand brand. Air New Zealand continually maintains our job as low risk, yet we can't independently assess that assurance without knowing the rate at which our colleagues have been infected. The Air New Zealand brand seems more important than their employees and the country which they call home.
Air New Zealand has repeatedly declined to tell us how many of its staff have contracted COVID-19. Even Grant Robertson, who's the shareholding minister in the 52% government-owned company, says he doesn't know.
Oh, look, I don't have up-to-date statistics on that. There was a handful of them in the early days of New Zealanders returning.
OK, are you able to find that number out for us?
Sure, absolutely.
And even after the government announced further border restrictions, including 14-day isolation at a managed facility earlier this month, flight crew kept their exemption. Now, Air New Zealand is currently operating 16 return international services a week, and at the end of May it plans to add 3 return services a week to Shanghai to that schedule. For more than a week now, Checkpoint has repeatedly asked Air New Zealand, the Ministry of Health and the Director General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, at his daily press conference for the number of Air New Zealand staff who have tested positive for COVID-19. Nobody has been able to give us that information. Checkpoint invited Air New Zealand onto the program. It has repeatedly declined to be interviewed. In a statement, it says it has been following the expert medical advice set out in the Ministry of Health guidelines. Air New Zealand has also confirmed it was one of the organisations that provided input on the guidelines. It says Air New Zealand's Chief Medical Officer is a world-renowned expert in aviation medicine. The company says if there are general concerns or questions about this advice, then that is a matter for the Ministry. Air New Zealand says staff who have concerns can raise these with the airline in a variety of ways. It goes on to say, we have our team of in-house aviation medicine doctors who have provided detailed advice to staff on reducing the risk of spreading infection and the Ministry of Health guidelines. It is 5:20 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. We're keen for your feedback on that one. Do you think that crew on Air New Zealand who are flying international routes should have the same mandatory stand down as any other traveller returning to New Zealand? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or there's always the email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. For the first time in history, the price of US oil has tumbled into negative territory. That means oil producers are paying buyers to take barrels off their hands over fears that storage capacity could run out in May. The main benchmark price for crude closed today at minus $37 a barrel. The ABC's Samantha Donovan has more.
At the closing bell of the New York Stock Exchange, the coronavirus had taken another toll. US crude futures are in negative territory for the first time in history. Analyst Emma Wall is with brokers Hargreaves Lansdowne in London. She's told the BBC World Service the reason for the plunge is simply a matter of supply and demand.
Oil reserves are nearly full because the world just doesn't need as much oil as it did before the coronavirus. Industry across the globe has slowed down, which meant that demand has fallen, and so supply is up and the price is down. To put it into some context, the last time oil was this cheap was the Asian financial crisis in 1998.
In January, a barrel of oil was costing about $63, but overnight the price fell to as low as minus $38 a barrel. Bob McNally is the president of consulting firm the Rapidan Energy Group and was an advisor on energy matters to the former US President George W. Bush. He's told RN Breakfast that because there's no storage capacity available in the hub of Cushing, Oklahoma, oil producers are having to pay someone to take the product off their hands.
There's no storage available in Cushing unless you secured it. It's been there's some physical capacity left, but the contracts or the rights to have storage have been sold off. So there are people who have a lot of oil they can't get rid of.
Bob McNally says the coronavirus is 90% to blame for the downturn.
An unprecedented collapse in a very short period of time of about 25% of global oil demand. We just haven't seen that.
He says the price plunge is a disaster for the big oil-producing countries like Iraq and Russia.
All the cheap petrol in the world is of no use if your car is going nowhere. We've just heard about storage issues in the US. CNN's John Defterius saying it's a once-in-a-lifetime event.
Those who are holding the physical oil are willing to pay others to take it off their hands, primarily because we're running out of storage. There's less than a month left of storage, very likely in the United States right now, with better than 500 million barrels already on the market, in the physical market, and there's no place to put it.
And in New Zealand, Z Energy is turning the tankers around, selling unwanted fuel back to the world market at a loss to avoid similar storage problems. Kiwi Bank's chief economist is Jared Kerr, and he joins us now. Jared, this is all a bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
So normally motorists would kind of expect to see a bit of an upside on this, but if people aren't driving their cars, what happens?
Well, look, take myself, for example. My car's full and I haven't driven it in weeks, so it doesn't benefit me yet. But hopefully when we get through these levels, then we'll be getting back into our cars at some stage.
So where do you actually think prices will go?
Well, they'll go south from here, but don't forget that there is I think it's $1.05 worth of tax on the price of petrol. So you can get down towards there, but it's highly unlikely to go through it.
So obviously storage has been an issue. Is it the same situation here in New Zealand? What capacity do we have to kind of stockpile?
Well, from what your article today suggests, it looks like we're turning away some ships already. So, demand really has dropped to near nothing at the moment. And, the oil market's still open and the producers are still pumping it out. So supply is ample, but there's no demand. Very little demand.
This might sound like a strange question, but does petrol go off?
I'm not sure. I am told that it does. So I guess we can store it, but for only so long.
Okay. Well, is this the first of the big commodity markets to fall to coronavirus?
It's the most obvious, yeah. And what actually happened overnight was the May contract fell out of bed. So there was news that the US was going to run out of storage in 2 weeks. So if you had a May contract, you literally couldn't take delivery of that oil. So the May contract dropped to $40, minus $40 a barrel. It's since bounced back into positive territory. What investors did is they dumped their May contracts and they purchased June. So the price of oil for June actually rose to $23 a barrel. It's a bit of a technical issue, but it does show that down the track, if we do see storage running out, then the price of oil can fall quite a bit further from where it is now.
When you say the June contracts went up, are they that betting against the fact that we will be more mobile and not so many of us around the world will be locked down?
I think investors panicked that they had to take delivery of oil in May and that there wouldn't be anywhere to store it. So they simply dumped that contract and there was no other buyers. That's why it went into the negatives. And there would have been some speculative investors that would have been catching that falling knife on the way down and caught it at -40, and now it's trading at $1. So they would have made $40 in 2 hours per barrel, and they would have been buying, hundreds of thousands of barrels at that level. What the others did is, as they escaped the May contract, they went out to June, hoping that something would normalise. You've just postponed the issue.
Great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us. That's Kiwi Bank's Chief Economist, Jared Kerr. And as he says, we are in fascinating times. First time in US history that a barrel of oil has gone into the negatives. The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, is close to death. According to international reports, the US is monitoring intelligence that the 36-year-old's health has seriously deteriorated following surgery earlier this month. CNN's Jim Sciutto describes Kim's condition as grave.
A U.S. official with direct knowledge tells me that the U.S. is now monitoring intelligence that the health of the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, is in grave danger. This is following a surgery in recent days. We should note that 5 days ago, Kim was notably absent from a ceremony honoring his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. He was absent from that ceremony 5 days ago. It was 4 days before when he was last seen in public at a Politburo meeting. So during those intervening days, there were questions. Why is he absent? And it's more recently that the U.S. has been monitoring intelligence that he had a surgery, that the aftermath of that surgery, there were complications, and his health is now in grave danger. With any intelligence issue regarding North Korea, that North Korea is the blackest of black boxes when it comes to intelligence for the U.S., a difficult box to penetrate. So when discussing intelligence about North Korea, you always have to keep that in mind. But again, you really have a combination of indicators here now. The intelligence about this surgery, the complications following it, but also his absence from that event a number of days ago. Kim has taken great pains in recent years to eliminate any potential competitors for power, including taking the alarming step of assassinating his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, in Kuala Lumpur airport. This is a couple of years ago, using a nerve agent. There are other senior North Korean officials who he eliminated via assassination. So that leaves gaping holes if he were not to survive this. There is his sister, who's in a very powerful position there, other senior officials, but it raises enormous questions. And we can report as well that the U.S., as these questions has been raised, have reached out to North Korean experts, including on the peninsula, to ask about contingency planning.
And that's Jim Sciutto reporting for CNN. President Donald Trump says he will suspend immigration to the United States. He made the announcement on Twitter a short time ago, saying he wants to protect American jobs and the country from the spread of COVID-19, which he has dubbed the invisible enemy. It's unclear how long the suspension could last and what it means for people who are already allowed to live and work in the US. The BBC's Peter Bowes has more.
As America itches to get back to normal, a surprise announcement from the president in a late-night tweet. In light of the attack from the invisible enemy, as well as the need to protect the jobs of our great American citizens, I'll be signing an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration into the United States. The invisible enemy is the term Mr. Trump has used to describe coronavirus. More than 22 million Americans have applied for unemployment benefits in the last month, and there are fears the economic fallout from COVID-19 could last for years. There are already bans on travel to the US from Europe and China. It comes as the country is slowly beginning to lift the restrictions on movement imposed to protect people from COVID-19. Some beaches in Florida are already open to the public. In Georgia, later this week, gyms, hair salons and bowling alleys will be back in business. And from next week, restaurants. Elsewhere in the country, Americans are running out of patience. In Phoenix, Arizona's capital city, demonstrators gathered to protest the state's continuing order to stay at home. At the White House, President Trump said he was working with state governors to ramp up coronavirus testing, a key part of the plan to reopen the country. And he highlighted support he's received from the governor of New York.
I want to draw your attention to Governor Cuomo's remarks during his press conference today. He said the president is right. The state's testing is up to the states to do, which will implement the tests and logistically coordinate the tests. We have about 300 labs in New York, and they're great labs, actually. And it's my job to coordinate those 300 labs. I think the president's right when he says that the states should lead.
Mr. Trump says he'll discuss the pandemic with Andrew Cuomo at the White House.
And that's Peter Bowes reporting. Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, the government moves to reassure worried parents and teachers that schools will be safe when they partially reopen next week. Fears for the mental health of farmers as the sector battles with the impacts of drought and COVID-19. And a food rescue charity asks for charity itself to save good quality food from going to waste during the lockdown. We'd love your feedback, especially about Air New Zealand and oil prices. You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Let's go now to Paul Brennan with the headlines.
Thanks, Lisa. Air New Zealand crew on international flights fear they are put at risk by an exemption, which means they don't have to go into quarantine when they get home. Yesterday, the airline confirmed staff had to self-isolate after claims some had disregarded physical distancing rules during a layover in Vancouver. GPs say the government has denied them millions of dollars of COVID-19 funding, which was promised to help them with costs. The health minister says GPs have been given $37 million and further funding is still being decided. The opposition has criticised government ministers for missing the mark at today's meeting of the Epidemic Response Committee. Neither Stuart Nash nor Willie Jackson could provide numbers or forecasts of the effects of the 5-day extension to the lockdown. And Simon Bridges says no analysis appears to have been done on how to protect small business. The Director-General of Health has reassured parents that there is very little risk of COVID-19 coming through the school gate. Some schools and ECE centres have expressed concerns about having to open under Alert Level 3, saying social distancing will be impossible. But Ashley Bloomfield says there is no undetected community transmission and children will be safe as long as classroom bubbles are kept small. The man shot dead by the police in Papatoetoe early yesterday has been named as 43-year-old Hitesh Navan Lal. 13 people called the police about Mr. Lal's actions and reported he was carrying a machete, damaging cars and power lines and trying to break into a house. After refusing to drop his weapon and moving towards an officer, he was fatally shot. And the Real Estate Institute has welcomed the proposed lifting of lending criteria for prospective house buyers, saying it's just what the market needs right now. The Reserve Bank is seeking feedback on lifting the requirement for a 20% deposit and allowing banks to have more than 1/5 of their lending with such buyers. And those are the headlines.
Thanks, Paul, and welcome back. This is Checkpoint, and I'm Lisa Owen. Let's get down to business now with Nona Peltier. Hey, Nona. Reserve Bank. Hi. The Reserve Bank is looking at removing the limits on loans to low deposit borrowers. What are the details?
Yeah, so we've had these loan-to-value ratios. They limit what retail banks can lend to buyers of homes. So 20% of banks lending, no more of 20% of their banks of what they can lend to buyers has to be with so if you want to buy a house, Lisa, this is how it goes. You have to have a 20% deposit, basically, if you're going to a retail bank. If you don't have a 20% deposit, you might not be able to get a mortgage from a retail bank. There are other options, but most people want to go to a bank. If you're a property investor, the limit is 30%. You have to have that as a deposit. Now, what the bank, the Reserve Bank, is looking at doing over the next 7 days, it's asking for some feedback from the industry, and it's thinking of taking away or reducing that those limitations so that the banks could borrow more or lend more money to borrowers.
That's
so
an
that
interesting.
would make it easier.
It's an interesting time to be considering that, given uncertainty perhaps around employment and the prospects of going into double-digit unemployment.
Well, at the same time, some economists anyway, are looking at forecasting 10 to 15% drop in the value of residential homes. So if your housing market falls out of bed, then so does a lot of other things start to happen as well. People perhaps will they won't have enough equity in their properties potentially. They won't be able to maintain those properties. There's a lot of downside. So, of course, the Reserve Bank wants to limit those kinds of risks. I mean, part of the job of the Reserve Bank is to ensure its financial stability. And one of those things, of course, would be the housing market. So the lending restrictions have been in place for, 6 years, apparently. Yeah, quite a long time. So, if they do come off, it might only be for 1 year and then another review would take place. That's what the Reserve Bank is suggesting. So it wouldn't be necessarily an all off. It might just be off for a little while through this, this crisis.
Interesting. Okay, so what else has been happening on the markets? As you were discussing earlier, the oil prices certainly really cast a very big concern over the market. So Z Energy, as we heard, they had to turn back some of their oil. They sold it back into the market at a loss, and their share price dropped today 3.6%. They don't have anywhere to put the oil either. So storage is an issue, and that's going to continue to be an issue because, we just don't have enough demand for it. Anyways, our own index, it fell down. That's the top 50 index, dropped 2.1% today, 227 points down to 10,536. So the New Zealand dollar also lost ground today. It fell to, it was about, 60.6 cents. This morning it was at 59.9 just a short while ago. 95 Australian and 48.2 British pence. And I think you're going to continue to see this weakness given this uncertainty probably going through Asia. Certainly it wasn't looking very strong there either. Thanks, Nona. Good to talk to you. That's Nona Peltier with our business wrap. And sticking with the business theme, the future of Virgin Australia is up in the air after the airline today entered voluntary administration. The company is insisting it will emerge financially stronger and will do its best to protect the jobs of at least 10,000 workers. But if it does collapse, it could mean Qantas again enjoys a monopoly over many Australian routes. The ABC's Peter Ryan has more.
A very sad morning, but inevitable given the federal government's point-blank refusal to provide a $1.4 billion loan to keep Virgin alive in its current form. As you mentioned, Virgin's board met last night and agreed they had no option but to call in the administrators or the corporate undertakers, especially after two ratings agencies, Moody's and Fitch, hit them with a downgrade yesterday. The advisory firm Deloitte now has the job of recapitalising more than $5 billion in debt and restructuring Virgin. Already, the administrator, Vaughan Strawbridge, says there's interest from 10 parties, but he wouldn't name them. So for now, it's business as usual as much as possible. Virgin will continue with its domestic and international routes as Deloitte plans to sell the company off as a whole rather than carving it off up and selling it off in pieces, given that private equity bidders are circling.
And that's Peter Ryan from the ABC. And we're on the topic of aviation. A lot of feedback here in relation to our earlier story about Air New Zealand. Air New Zealand is refusing to say how many of its staff have contracted COVID-19. And also some staff members are raising concerns about the fact that international crews, cabin crews, don't have a 14-day stand down when they return home like any other New Zealand traveller. A lot of you don't like that. This person says, remarkable approach given how many staff they must have had not working at the time. Someone else says they absolutely should be quarantined after international flights. This is disgusting and the minister should step in and change this lax policy immediately. I don't really enjoy living by myself or not doing my own shopping or visiting my grandchildren, but this is all in vain if New Zealand doesn't play the game too. Keep safe, says Susan. Someone else says Air New Zealand, rule for them and another rule for us. It makes a mockery of the lockdown. This person is Hugh has got in touch to say Air New Zealand cabin crew did a great job of getting my wife and I home in time to go into 14 days isolation. Since then, many have lost their jobs. Please look after these COVID heroes. Thanks for getting in touch, Hugh. And this one says Air New Zealand staff should be isolated when they come back from overseas travel, and that they have plenty of staff to rotate. And they should take a stronger attitude to public safety, is what that person is saying. And then Caroline from Christchurch has got in touch saying, of course they should go into isolation. They could be perfect carriers for the virus. Outrageous that they've been given an exemption. And this one finally, come on Air New Zealand, you're letting down a team of 5 million. Still handing out lollies when restaurants are doing it hard. No stand down between flights when everyone else has stood down for a month. As a state-supported airline, play with the rest of the team, not against us, by bringing the virus in your own back door, Anne says. And Anne is from Littleton. Thanks for getting in touch. The government is reassuring worried parents and teachers that its plan to partially reopen schools and early learning centres next week is safe and workable. In briefings today, the Education Minister Chris Hipkins and government officials insisted they are not putting anybody at risk. More than 35,000 people have signed a petition opposing the decision to let children up to year 10 return to class if their parents need to go back to work next week. And the Early Childhood Council has told its members not to reopen until the country reaches alert level 2. Here's our education correspondent, John Gerritsen.
Chris Hipkins fronted today's 1pm COVID-19 briefing. He said the decision to partially reopen schools and early learning centres is based on the best public health advice.
I know that physical distancing will be very difficult with children and young people, particularly the youngest children in early childhood education. We've reached the point where the Director-General of Health is confident that there is no widespread undetected community transmission in New Zealand. So the chance of it coming through the door or through the gate in the first place is low.
The government has been challenged to produce evidence that young children are at low risk of getting the virus. At the 1pm briefing, the Director-General of Health, Ashley Bloomfield, said evidence that children are relatively safe from the virus started to emerge in a World Health Organization report on the outbreak in Wuhan.
Of all the people they interviewed who had been involved in dealing with COVID-19, not one could recall any instance of a child passing infection to an adult. And this seems to be the pattern that has been found in other countries. And we've, of course, got here in New Zealand just a small number of our cases are in under 10-year-olds for a start, and all of those are actually linked to transmission within the family setting.
Ashley Bloomfield appeared again in a live video briefing this afternoon, answering questions with the Secretary for Education, Iona Holstead. He said there's little chance of anyone bringing COVID-19 into a school or early childhood centre during level 3, and teachers will be told what to do to reduce the chances of infection.
Our advice that has been taken up is around keeping groups small, not mixing groups, not using common spaces in the school setting, having good cleaning practices in place and supporting good hygiene, and of course the physical distancing as much as possible.
Iona Holstead said schooling at alert level 3 will not be school as we know it. Classes are unlikely to run as they normally do, and children will be kept in groups of no more than 10, including their teacher.
We're talking about a bubble of 10, so including the teacher. But can I also say that I know that there are principals out there already who are working on, and particularly older groups, children of year 8, 9, 10, and maybe even older, who can work out what 10 looks like and can be in a bubble of 10 with 3 bubbles of 10 in a large open environment, still one teacher.
Iona Holstead said children should stay home if they can, as the ministry is aiming to have as few children at school and early learning as possible. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko John Gerritsen tēnei.
It is 17 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Just wondering if you were reassured by what you heard from the Minister today and also health officials around the safety of children returning to school. There are fears for farmers' mental health as the sector battles with the impacts of drought and COVID-19. Farming leaders say lockdown has magnified the challenges that isolation presents in rural communities, and they're urging people to pick up the phone and check in on their neighbours. Rural reporter Mahi filed this report and a warning. This story discusses suicide and could be distressing to some people.
Drought, the closure of sale yards and reduced processing capacity at meatworks due to COVID-19 means many farmers are carrying more stock than they anticipated going into winter. Farming groups say this is putting a huge strain on already stretched feed resources and it's impacting morale. Central North Island farm consultant Jeff Burton says farmers already had plenty on their plates and certainly didn't need these extra worries.
Life can be full of decisions and worries, and I think it can actually grind you down very easily. And if you get a drought and COVID-19 and things like that on top of it, it can be just enough to tip the balance, getting into a big dark abyss. And unfortunately, we've had one or two people that I know, have known for a long time, who have unfortunately taken the most severe step and put an end to their lives recently.
While New Zealand is only about 6 weeks away from winter, some parts of the country, including Northland and Hawke's Bay, are still in the grips of drought. Hawke's Bay farmer and sheep and beef analyst Mel Crude says it can be overwhelming for farmers facing feed shortages or dealing with animal welfare issues.
And the first person you blame is yourself, and unfortunately that puts a lot of pressure on those farmers that just cannot see any way out. But I think there are resources out there, and there's definitely support and help out there in our rural communities for those that are struggling to find supplementary feed, to find a buyer for their livestock, to be able to get stock killed. So I think we need to really emphasise that as well.
Golden Bay dairy farmer Wayne Langford knows what it's like to suffer from depression. He has a blog where he shares tips on what helped him when life got tough on farm. Mr Langford says farmers are used to working in isolation, but COVID-19 has magnified that, with the usual chats at the sale yards, or even just with neighbours, a bit of a distant memory now.
I thought about that myself, just wanting to, pop down to the neighbour's cow shed and have a yarn type thing, and I can't do that at the moment, and it's probably been 5 weeks since I've done it. So I can't wait to get back to that scenario again, and then like say the other pressures of not being able to get stock away, the dry kicking in, and winter fast approaching it. It's all just adding up. But like I say, I just encourage farmers to kind of just pick up that phone and talk to each other.
The chair of the Rural Support Trust, Neil Baitup, agrees that in these circumstances it's even more important to phone neighbours and friends to check in on them.
Yeah, just keep talking to them, ask them how they're feeling, and then ask them again so that they actually say, look, really, how are you, and sort of dig a bit deeper.
Neil Baitup says the Trust understands this is a very stressful time for farmers, and he says it has staff all over the country who are there to help. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Maya Burry.
What happens when your local food bank runs out of food? That was almost the case for the Masterton Food Bank, whose supplies ran dry after seeing a threefold increase in demand late last week. Local supermarkets and other donors came to the rescue, but already those supplies are being carried out by the box load. Despite having no active cases of COVID-19 in the district, many are struggling with a halt in employment or separation from loved ones. Our reporter Logan Church and cameraman Dominic Thomas filed this report.
The Masterton Food Bank, tucked behind the main street, services much of the wide upper. Before COVID-19, it was already busy, giving out up to 30 food parcels a day. We visited from a safe distance an hour after opening today. It had already given out that much.
It's been a real education for us. We've been rushed off our feet, Logan, but we are getting there. We've had 10 times more parcels than we usually do.
That's the food bank coordinator, Lynn Tankersley. She and a small team of volunteers, including her husband, are stacking, packing and giving out boxes after boxes of food with machine-like efficiency.
Yeah, instead of just packing one parcel at a time, we now do more of a conveyor belt thing where, you do 10 at a time. But wheat bix, milk, so you're packing more parcels at a time. And we have parcels pre-packed, so we just need to put a label on them to say where they're going. And, so we've changed things. Of course, nobody comes in. We have a table and stuff set up outside, and we take the parcels out and put them on the table. Those sort of things have changed.
But last week, the whole operation almost ground to a halt. On Friday, they gave out 90 boxes of food. And for this little food bank, it was almost too much.
The shelves were empty. I mean, you can see they're quite full now, but they were empty. I was panicking, I was panicking a bit because we had the weekend to fill up, and we did manage to fill up. But, to get food in for Monday was a bit of a concern.
That new stock is already flying out to the door. Even while we talk, people are still coming and going, picking up food boxes left on a small white trestle table in the car park out front. First a homeless man, then workers from the local Māori health centre. Only minutes later, another person rolls up.
Going to take some kai to the whānaus, make sure that they're okay.
Despite having no active COVID cases, lockdown has presented challenges for many here, including being out of work or being kept away from loved ones. Stay-at-home mum Jodie, who was returning from a walk to the supermarket, has found it extra tough.
Oh, very tiring, very long. Baby that doesn't want to settle. It's just been, out of routine. It's even kilted everybody. It's caused a lot of depression and anxiety for me, but we're getting there, as we all can do.
But as lockdown continues until midnight next Monday and alert level 3 comes in, the food bank team is expecting to be busy and stay busy for the foreseeable future.
I might have a holiday when it's all over, I think.
For Checkpoint, Logan Church.
And if you were listening to that on the radio, you can look back online for Logan and Dom's piece. We'll put it up with the video. Meanwhile, a food rescue charity has been forced to ask for charity itself to save good quality food from going to waste during the lockdown. Fair Food collects food from organisations that would otherwise go to landfill and distributes it to the needy. But whilst it's classified as an essential service, without volunteers, it's struggling to get the food to where it is most needed. And as LEJ reports, the organisation isn't entitled to the government's wage subsidy.
We've got 400 loaves of bread. We've got 7 pallets of frozen chicken, and every one of those pallets has hundreds and hundreds of really good chicken. We've got 7 pallets of fresh tomatoes. We've got 7 pallets of potatoes, onions and carrots.
That's Veronica Shale from Fair Food in Auckland. The organisation works to save fit-to-eat, good quality food from going to landfill.
So pre-COVID, we rescued from supermarkets. We've got a partnership with Countdown and Farrows, and then also some other manufacturers and other food producers and things like that. We're a mobile service, so we're pretty lean and we're pretty nimble. We sort either on premise or in the back of our vans, and we distribute it that day to over 50 organisations throughout Auckland, and that's ranging from Women's Refuge to teen parenting groups to food banks to the Sally Army to the Mission.
Food waste organisations are classified as an essential service, but government restrictions mean the Fair Food team has gone from having a team of 70 volunteers to just a small number of full-time staff. The amount their small team have had to deal with has also increased. They're now taking in extra from food producers and independent retailers. Veronica says the staff have stepped up massively, but it's not sustainable.
That means weekends. That means on call. That means begging and borrowing other people with trucks that will volunteer and drive for us that can. That's not really sustainable because they need funding to do that as well. So for us, we've seen, a shift in the workforce, need for different infrastructure. Where we have rescued, it's been a real mix of produce, of quality. So unfortunately, that's had to go to the pigs or whatever, which is still a great place for it to go rather than landfill. But it's not been as good a produce as we've had in the past. What we've found, which isn't really surprising, but maybe is unexpected for people to hear, is obviously with businesses closing down, the food growers, producers, the manufacturers, there must be a lot going to waste that we can't all rescue it all, but there is a lot we're now rescuing. It's a real pivot for most food rescue organisations, including Fair Food, as to how we service that. So we've had to source extra containers, chiller containers, and that's been a little bit tricky, but we've got there.
Veronica says what the government and Auckland Council are doing is amazing, and that the food rescued by Fair Food and other food waste organisations is a great fresh addition to the dry goods and store-covered items being given out in welfare packages. Despite being an essential service, Fair Food aren't covered by a lot of government funding programs.
There's no staff subsidy as such, and our workforce was mostly volunteers. So how do you compensate for that generosity and that skill and that knowledge and just that physical manpower? And look, food just can't rescue itself, you kind of need some help. So our staff are doing extra hours. We have got some volunteers that have offered their trucks and are doing that. I don't think that's sustainable. They're at some point, yesterday they were asking for even just diesel, and we don't know if we can even give it to them.
Ironically, Veronica says her food charity is now itself asking for charity.
So Fair Food, like a lot of other organisations, we have started our own Give a Little page for people to donate to COVID relief, so we can basically rescue this really good food that would go to waste from your food business and growers and get it to these people in need and continue to do that in a really timely and safe manner.
Fair Food has saved almost 400,000 kilos of food and delivered more than 1 million meals to needy New Zealanders since it was founded in 2012. It's also saved 2.3 million kilos of waste from going to landfill. Veronica Shell hopes the charity will survive to deliver much more beyond the pandemic. For Checkpoint, I'm Ellie J.
Private text messages between the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and Meghan Markle's father have been revealed in court as part of the couple's claim against newspapers. Prince Harry and Meghan have also sent a letter to some of the country's biggest tabloids saying they will never work with them again. The BBC's Nicholas Witchell has more.
It's 6 weeks since they walked away from Britain, and now Harry and Meghan are stamping out the rules of their new non-royal life. And rule number one, it seems, is that they'll have no contact with Britain's tabloid newspapers. They're tired of what they call distorted, false or invasive stories. Harry has had a difficult relationship with the tabloids for years. It's a dislike from which he's never moved on.
They, early on, have been so prickly with the press. They've almost encouraged them to misbehave. To be honest with you, I would say that their better judgment was that they should simply ignore it. Ignore it, and if the papers are not getting a rise out of them, they won't continue to do it.
Meghan is currently suing Associated Newspapers over the publication by the Mail on Sunday of extracts from a private letter she sent her estranged father, Thomas. The Sussex's lawyers have now disclosed some of the text messages the couple sent to Mr Markle just before the royal wedding, after he'd become entangled with the media. In one text, Harry said, "Any speaking to the press will backfire. Trust me, Tom. Only we can help you, as we have been trying from day one." In another text, Meghan said, "I've been reaching out to you all weekend, but you're not taking any of our calls or replying to any texts." Meghan and Harry are now concentrating on new opportunities. She was heard on US television today talking about a Disney film she's narrated about elephants.
And if we had more of an awareness about the obstacles we're facing, I think we'd take care of each other, this planet, and animals in a very different way.
2 months into their new life, and Harry and Meghan are doing their best to navigate a new course. Supporters will applaud them taking on the tabloid press. Detractors will question their judgment as the world wrestles with more pressing matters.
Nicholas Witchell reporting there. And just before we get to the news, we have had a statement from Grant Robertson's office. Obviously, he's the shareholding minister for Air New Zealand. Last night he said to us that he could get the figures for us for the number of staff that had tested positive for COVID-19. His office has got in touch to say Air New Zealand has not advised the Minister of Finance of the number of Air New Zealand staff who have tested positive, because it is in the interests of the privacy and welfare of its employees not to reveal the numbers. On the subject of the quarantine exemption, the office of Mr Robertson has confirmed that yes, the quarantine exemption still exists, but says Air New Zealand is strictly following Ministry of Health guidelines to keep its customers and crew safe, including the Ministry's advice on self-isolation and appropriate PPE use. As advised by the Ministry of Health, unless unwell, airline crew who follow the correct precautions are exempt from the requirement to self-isolate. During Alert Level 4, Air New Zealand crew are isolated isolating in their bubbles when not required to work. So in between flights, they do have to go home and be in their bubbles at lockdown level 4, but there's nothing preventing them from flying again on overseas duties. And some more feedback from you listeners on this as well. Beth has got in touch to say the situation with Air New Zealand is simply illogical. If everyone coming from overseas acted the way that airline crew are acting, no self-isolating and working again within 14 days, we'd be in lockdown until a vaccination was available, maybe next year or 2020. It's time someone from Air New Zealand came on and explained how this makes sense. We should be clear, Beth, it's a number of the crew who are raising concerns about there not being a mandatory stand-down period. And someone else says, I regularly fly from Napier to Auckland for cancer therapy, have compromised immunity. Makes me wonder how tight Air New Zealand systems are.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Good evening, I'm Paul Brennan. Air New Zealand crew on international flights fear they and the public are being put at risk by their not being forced to quarantine when they get home. It's emerged that an Air New Zealand flight attendant who had just returned from the US and who'd been exposed to the coronavirus has a direct link to one of the country's biggest COVID-19 clusters. These are the revoiced words of an airline staff member talking to Checkpoint.
On 19 March, NZ5 arrived at Auckland from LAX, on which 3 passengers tested positive for COVID-19. At least 2 crew later tested positive. A crew member from that flight, before testing positive, went down to Bluff to attend a wedding. And now we all know about the Bluff cluster.
Air New Zealand says it's been following the expert medical advice set out in the Health Ministry guidelines. General practitioners say they've been denied millions of dollars of COVID-19 funding promised to them. The Medical Association, which represents doctors, says the government promised $22 million to help them with costs, but they've only received half and have been told they won't be getting the rest. The association's GP representative, Jan White, says it's incredibly disappointing.
We need the government, this government, any other government, to actually understand what general practice does and the extent of what we do and the goodwill that's involved in what we do, that general practice steps up to the plate every time they're asked to.
Jan White, the Health Minister David Clark, says GPs have been given $37 million in support and further funding is still being decided. The Director-General of Health says there's not much difference between the New Zealand and Australian response to COVID-19. The opposition has criticised the government for extending the lockdown, pointing to Australia, which appears to be getting the virus under control with looser restrictions on business. Epidemiologist Michael Baker says New Zealand had to go harder than Australia because its public health infrastructure and testing was weaker. But Ashley Bloomfield disagrees.
The reality is that Australia's response, and particularly in some states, is very similar. The actual impact of it is very similar to New Zealand, so I don't think there's that big a difference between our two responses.
Ashley Bloomfield says while the national network needs to be strengthened, it has performed well. Work on the country's biggest infrastructure project, Auckland City Rail Link, will resume a week after the Level 4 lockdown ends. The chief executive of the project, Sean Sweeney, says they're already inspecting sites this week and have made plans so they can get out of the blocks quickly. He says it'll be months before they know to what extent the lockdown has affected budgets and timelines. There could be a shortage of shipping containers as the country moves into Alert Level 3. More freight will be moved, including exports that were not rated as essential under Level 4. But because of the declining volume of imports, empty containers may start to become scarce. The Chief Executive of Port of Tauranga, Mark Kens, says it's keeping a close eye on shipments over the next few months.
There was a looming shortage with all of those non-essential containers being locked into terminals and warehouses, but I think that's been resolved of late, but I think we're just keeping a weather eye on the amount of imports that are coming into New Zealand in the future months.
Mark Ken says the cost to exporters could rise if empty containers need to be imported. Authorities will decide next week whether the removal of 10,000 tonnes of hazardous waste from Matilda's disused paper mill can resume. The so-called Uvea premix, a byproduct of Tiwai Point aluminium production, was dumped at the mill in 2015 by the now liquidated company Taha Asia Pacific. Timothy Brown has more.
The waste, which can emit a toxic ammonia cloud when mixed with water, came under threat in February when the Matoda River flooded. Since then, the government has been trying to fast-track its removal. A deal was reached in 2018 to remove the waste over 6 years, but under the Level 4 lockdown, that work stopped. The Environment Ministry says authorities are meeting to decide whether it can resume when the country moves to Level 3. This is Timothy Brown.
It's 6:04. Sport now. World Rugby is investigating serious allegations against the chair of the Fiji Rugby Union, who's been nominated for a position on its influential executive committee. The British newspaper The Sunday Times reports it's heard a recording of Francis Keane using homophobic language while he was in charge of the Fiji prison service. Vinnie Wiley reports.
World Rugby says it is taking the allegations against Francis Keane extremely seriously. The governing body says it's currently discussing the matter with the Fiji Rugby Union. Keane, who was convicted of manslaughter in 2007, was elected chair of the FRU 5 years ago and has been on the World Rugby Council since 2018. The former Navy commander, who is the brother-in-law of Fiji's Prime Minister and FRU President Frank Bainimarama, is one of 8 nominations for 7 vacancies on the Executive Committee, which are due to be voted on next month. Ko Vinnie Wiley tēnei.
And in football, the All Whites won't get to defend the Oceania Nations Cup at home. The June tournament has been cancelled. And that's the news. On to the short forecast now, taking us through to midnight tomorrow Wednesday. Northland to Manawatu, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the central high country. Mainly fine, high cloud, some showers in Coromandel today. Areas of morning low cloud or fog tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, cloudy periods, a few showers later today and tomorrow morning. Hortowhenua to Wellington, also Waited Upper, mainly fine but cloudy in the west tomorrow evening. Nelson, Marlborough, Canterbury, Otago and Southland, mainly fine, variable high cloud. However, scattered rain in Southland and Otago this evening, a few spots possible in South Canterbury. Buller, Westland and Fiordland, cloud increasing, rain developing south of Hokitika today and spreading further north tomorrow before easing. Chatham Islands, cloudy periods with a few showers today, mainly fine tomorrow. It's nearly 6:06.
Thanks, Paul. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. The leader of the world's most secretive country is apparently close to death. The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has reportedly suffered complications after surgery. CNN's Paula Hancock joins us from Seoul with the latest details. Paula, when did people start getting suspicious that something wasn't right here?
Well, Lisa, the reporting that we have at this point is that one US official with direct knowledge of the matter said that they are monitoring intelligence that suggests that Kim Jong-un is in grave danger after undergoing a surgery. Now, we don't have a lot more than that. We do have from another source familiar with the intelligence saying that they are closely monitoring all these reports on Kim's health and that the concerns about his health are credible, but at this point the severity is hard to assess. Now, we also did hear from one online publication here in Seoul, Daily NK, saying that they believed that he had gone under heart surgery on April the 12th. And that would be in line with what we saw a few days later, one of the most important days on the North Korean calendar, which is the Day of the Sun, the birth date of the country's founder, Kim Il-sung. Usually that is marked with military parades or has been with missile and satellite launches in the past. And Kim Jong-un was not visible and not present at that, as far as we can tell from North Korean media. So that is something that people were alerted to as well. But to be honest, we won't know for sure exactly what has happened, if anything, with Kim Jong-un until North Korea tells us so. It is well known that it is a very difficult country for the US as well as other countries to have decent intelligence on. It is a very closed country. So this, at this point, is something that the US is monitoring. They say they believe they have intelligence saying he's in grave danger, but beyond that, they can't say anything with conviction. Lisa?
What we do know, though, obviously, is that his health has not been the best in recent years, has it?
That's right. I mean, back in 2014, he actually disappeared from view for about 40 days, and there was plenty of speculation back then as to what exactly had happened to him. And then he reappeared in the public eye, and he had a cane. It was reported from North Korea itself that he had had problems with his feet, potentially. There were reports about gout as well. But this just shows how if the North Korean leader disappears from view for any length of time, then the speculation will start. It is a very sensitive topic within North Korea itself as well. The fact that this is the leader of the country, the most important person within the country, and this is the sort of information that would be kept secret even from his own people or from many of the elites if, in fact, he had undergone surgery, if, in fact, he is believed to be in bad health, as these reports would suggest. So it does show that it will be North Korea, who will confirm whether or not this is accurate and whether or not there are serious concerns about his health. And they will do that when they are ready, not a second before.
We're almost out of time, but very quickly, who would be a likely successor?
This is obviously going one step beyond what we know at this point, but the favourite, I assume, would be his sister, Kim Yo-jong. She's been very high profile since 2018 in the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics in South Korea, when she actually appeared on behalf of her brother, and when there was the start of the diplomatic thaw in relations between North and South Korea. She has had a number of promotions over the past couple of years. She is frequently seen at the side of her brother during very high-profile summits with other world leaders. So I think the general feeling is that she could potentially be a high-profile figure going forward, if not taking over the reins. But of course, that is one step ahead of where we are right now.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us this evening. That is Paula Hancox from CNN, joining us live from Seoul. Government ministers have been bombarded with questions about their lack of analysis on how small businesses would survive an extended lockdown period. Small Business Minister Stuart Nash has been asked repeatedly at today's Epidemic Response Committee on whether any analysis had been presented to Cabinet before the decision was made on extending level 4 by 5 days. Opposition MPs are arguing that could be the final straw for some businesses whose backs are against the wall. Our political reporter Charlie Drever has the details.
There was much to discuss at today's Epidemic Response Committee, but there was one question in particular that kept cropping up for Small Business Minister Stuart Nash, asked here by the committee's chair, National's Simon Bridges.
Can you tell us how many businesses will effectively go out of business because of the longer period in lockdown? Did you go armed with any analysis of any kind about the effects of an additional week of lockdown? Did you go to Cabinet with any analysis?
Despite the many attempts to get a straight answer from Mr Nash, this was all Mr Bridges was going to get.
You're telling us you haven't done any work on that.
I'm not telling you that at all, Mr Chair. What I am saying is it is my considered opinion and the opinion of my colleagues is that if we get this health response under control and we work to eliminate COVID from our country, our economy is going to come out of this a lot faster. Our small businesses will survive in a way they wouldn't if we let this thing get out of control.
Simon Bridges says a bakery in his electorate has told him they're feeling the pressure of facing 7 weeks of no business, as even with the wage subsidy, there are still other costs that need to be met.
They say, while we realise the lockdown has been necessary to curb the spread of COVID, we are absolutely gutted that our livelihoods are shattered due to our business closure. We are the sacrificial lambs and are, they say, completely unsupported.
But Mr Nash argues businesses can set up a click and collect option for customers. And once again, comparisons were made with how our neighbours across the ditch are handling the COVID-19 crisis. National MP Todd McClay asked why there hasn't been more direct financial support for businesses.
I'm pleading with you, Minister, on behalf of small businesses. They need a cash injection now, as we've seen from the Australian government, and merely funding to help workers has been very good for those workers, but it's not going to keep more businesses in New Zealand in business.
Stuart Nash pushed back against claims that Australia was doing better by its businesses before things got heated.
Australian businesses will not see any money until the beginning of May. Our businesses saw 12 weeks worth of wages into their...
But they're still able to trade, Minister.
McClay,
the point is that they are still able to trade.
Can we have the Minister answering questions and not being constantly interrupted?
Mr Nash also spoke about the tax breaks that will also be available to businesses. And when it was time for the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, to speak, he said the government has the business community's support.
Everybody's concerned about the length of time that we spend in level 4 or level 3 because it clearly does restrict activity, but we are sticking to our judgment, staying the course that we believe doing it once and doing it right is the best for the economy.
Mr Robertson also disputed there was a lack of analysis. He says Treasury has already provided Cabinet scenarios that accounted for a month at level 4 and a month at level 3, a week longer than the 2 levels combined are expected to last. However, Simon Bridges says ministers should have arrived at the meeting with numbers on SMEs and unemployment.
I grant that forecasting and scenarios and so on in a very uncertain situation never going to be perfect, but you'd like to think they would at least have tried at some level.
Mr Bridges says it's important to know what it will mean for those businesses who will be in jeopardy the longer lockdown continues. For Checkpoint, Ko Charlie Drever, DNA.
And in other political news, a decision has been made that Parliament will meet again next Tuesday. I'm sure that's got you all relieved, but it will be in a very limited way under the shifting lockdown levels, with only the number of MPs needed present. It will resume for question time, ministerial statements, and to pass urgent business related to the government's COVID-19 response. Now, Parliament's Business Committee will decide tomorrow exactly what the rules will be, and I'm sure we'll bring that to you as it comes to hand. It is 6:15. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Health workers' unions hope that an external review of personal protective gear, or PPE, will mean they never again have to worry about facing a pandemic without protection. The Auditor-General announced today it would do an independent review of how the Ministry of Health manages and distributes PPE supplies to health workers. The review will take 4 weeks, but those on the front line remain nervous the shift to level 3 next week will place more pressure on already stretched supplies. Rachel Thomas reports.
The Nurses Union says that in the 4th week of lockdown, access to PPE is still an issue for some healthcare workers. Now, an independent review by the Office of the Auditor-General will look for gaps in the system, but the process will take 4 weeks. Kerry Nuku from the New Zealand Nurses Organisation says it's a shame healthcare workers have had to wait this long for it to begin.
Every time that we've raised issues where there's been shortages within workplaces, we've seen an immediate response from the District Health Board to go and fix the problems, and that's been fantastic. But it's not okay that we have to either go to media or raise these problems before the attention is addressed.
The union E2, which represents aged care workers, has also been raising the issue since the beginning of the pandemic. E2 National Secretary Bill Newson says there's been a profound gap between policy and what workers can access on the day.
It's all very well to have a policy and to have a plan and to have best intentions, but we need the appropriate PPE gear to be available.
Bill Newson says access to PPE is likely to get more acute as more people return to offices next week.
It's been an issue for essential workers, but that issue is going to broaden out. And our view is that any productive work has to be COVID-safe work, and of course PPE. And the provision of PPE, is an important part of that.
Kerry Nuku says the Nurses Union expects there to be spikes in transmission once people start moving around a little more.
Once we start to increase the bubbles, the likelihood of transmission may increase. So that's where PPE becomes really critical, and making sure that we've got that steady supply of stock as we need it.
The Director-General of Health says there is good stock in New Zealand, but has welcomed the review. Ashley Bloomfield says the Health Ministry has a system designed to ensure stocks are distributed throughout the country, but he's open to ideas.
We have taken on that responsibility to distribute it to a whole range of providers that previously we wouldn't have, and that we have done that successfully. We have also ensured good supply lines, and I look forward to any recommendations that the Auditor-General has got about how we could continue to improve that.
Kerry Nuku says she'd like to see the review iron out problems now to avoid these shortages happening ever again.
We would certainly like to hope that if there's a future pandemic, that we're not in the same place as nurses or healthcare professionals asking for access to PPE gear. But all of the independent reviews that are happening will help to strengthen up what we need to do in the future to prepare.
The Office of the Auditor-General says it will have its recommendations ready and make them publicly available in 4 weeks' time. For Checkpoint, call Rachel Thomas, DNA.
The police in Canada say some of the victims of yesterday's shooting in Nova Scotia were known to the gunman. At least 18 people are dead, and the police say that figure will almost certainly rise. A national vigil will be held online tomorrow for the country's deadliest mass shooting. The BBC's Matt Graveling has more.
This was a hero's welcome.
And for a community in mourning, finally, something to cheer about. Constable Chad Morrison was shot while responding to reports of a gunman killing people across Nova Scotia this weekend. The officer had been in hospital since the attack. Tragically, others were not so fortunate, losing their life at the hands of gunman Gabriel Wortman. This included Morrison's colleague, Constable Heidi Stevenson, known by many in the community.
Some of the people have said she's a beautiful person and her smile lit up a room, and just how caring she was, and she was so sweet and always had a goofy humour.
People in Nova Scotia have paid tribute to the fallen, leaving flowers, flags and signs outside of this police station. But while people stop to remember, officers continue to look for answers. Why did Wortman, a 51-year-old man who owned a denture clinic, dress as a police officer, get into a marked police car and begin killing innocent people? Wortman was killed after being intercepted by officers at a petrol station in Enfield, about 92 kilometres south of Portapique. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said his government was on the verge of introducing bans to assault-style weapons before the coronavirus outbreak.
The pandemic will prevent us from mourning together in person, but a vigil will be held virtually to celebrate the lives of the victims at 7 p.m. on Friday through the Facebook group Colchester Supporting Our Community.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ending that report from the BBC. Struggling New Zealanders look set to benefit from the initiative of two New Zealand farmers who want to feed the poor. The pair started plans to donate meat a year ago, but say the COVID-19 crisis makes their enterprise even more necessary. Eric Frickberg reports.
The so-called Meet the Need program was thought up a year ago, long before anyone had worries about COVID-19. But the founding farmers, Siobhan O'Malley and Wayne Langford, say the virus has given the scheme an extra sharp focus. Mr Langford, who's a dairy farmer from Golden Bay, says the project is coming together.
Farmers from all over the country are contacting us at the moment, so it's an ever-growing operation, which is really exciting. And we're hoping to have well over 1,000 animals donated this year.
Wayne Langford says the animals will be processed into 500-gram packs of mince for city missions and food banks, and they'll deliver them to the needy. He says it doesn't feel right that farmers feed so many millions of people overseas when there are people hungry in New Zealand. And that was a need both he and Ms O'Malley recognised long before the latest crisis.
It's been about 12 months in the making, and we could never have predicted that COVID was going to come along, and now it has. So great time to be launching in terms of helping those that are in need in New Zealand out. But this is a long-term project which we hope to make a huge difference. Food poverty seen in New Zealand into the future.
Silverfern Farms has undertaken to process the stock at cost and says it's able to handle sheep, deer and cattle. The scheme is seen as significant because a donated beef cattle can be worth $1,200, and that contrasts strongly with a few dollars usually dropped in charity buckets by passers-by on the street. For Checkpoint, Eric Frickberg.
While many community groups have had to put their hobbies on hold during the lockdown, a Palmerston North choir is taking a novel approach to keeping its singing alive. 6 to 60 has members of all ages, as the name suggests, including many elderly members. As the country began to shut down, its director had to get creative to keep them safe. Now they're singing online, providing a vital lifeline for those feeling a little lonely. Logan Church reports.
We've got Wednesday singing class, so I'm just going to teach just as normal, apart from we're not doing a warm-up. Sorry, Vanessa.
This isn't your normal choir rehearsal.
So we're going to sing I'm Still Standing as warm-up. Everyone ready? Here we go.
Every week, Palmerston North Choir 6 to 60 meets to sing, laugh and spend time together under the direction of local singer Amy Hunt.
We've got a huge range. We've got lots of grandparents, family groups that come along together, so mothers and children and then their parents, and heaps of different kind of community groups within our choir as well.
Even before the lockdown began, Amy decided the choir could not meet in person anymore, especially given elderly members were especially vulnerable to COVID-19.
I was already kind of trying to come up with a plan to keep them involved, because for for a lot of those ones, especially the most vulnerable, it is something that they've got. It's their thing that they can do during the week to keep their spirits up. So I really had to try and make something to just keep everybody in touch and keep everyone singing. Yeah, we meet every single week, and so it was a bit of a clinch when I thought, oh, what are we going to do? We're in lockdown.
So she had an idea. Moved the rehearsals onto Facebook, with the choir members joining in live.
So I decided to go online. So it was a bit scary at first. I thought, how's it going to work out? We had a big sing-along and did lots of our numbers together and some new songs, and they could all comment and be interactive, and so it was really, really cool. It was a really cool chance to connect with everybody and see everyone popping up, and it felt like we were all together again.
So far, they've done one rehearsal online. Participants aren't able to hear each other, but sing along with Amy and post their efforts if they feel like it. Lois Wills, who's in her late 50s, was among those who took part.
We all need something, and most of the time, or much of the time, that something comes with other people. And that's what this choir, this singing group gives us. And more importantly, I think this is what this group gives the community.
And the best bit of virtual choir practice.
I'm going to say this only once. Jamas was the order of the uniform. Thank goodness there wasn't video. I will get dressed up and put makeup on next week, though.
Amy Hunt hopes the practices will continue throughout the lockdown, with singing making isolation that's a little bit easier for everyone tuning in. For Checkpoint, Logan Church.
Well, time to get to some of your feedback now on the subject of schools reopening in a limited capacity. So once we go to level 3, they will be open for children up to year 10. Now, that's if parents need to send their kids to school. The preference is for children to stay home and continue digital learning. This person has got in touch saying, I am the principal of a secondary school. The health authorities have presented a convincing case for a limited reopening of schools. We need to do our bit to help our parents get back to work. The vast majority of teachers will be continuing online teaching, this principal says. I understand people being concerned, but much of the discussion has been uninformed panic. Also, we have had another email just on the topic of education. This person, Catherine, says the Ministry of Education has purposefully insisted that every new build and alteration in schools is done as an open space, modern learning environment. So often 3 classrooms are combined for a large learning space of up to 120 children or sometimes more. This has been done to save costs as there are fewer internal walls and also to promote teaching, digital education and some other ideological changes. This means that New Zealand schools have increasingly few conventional classrooms and many large open spaces with small breakout rooms in both primary and secondary schools. Over time, the concept of MLEs has become more developed with some very large MLEs being built. These are modern learning environments. How is the Ministry of Education proposing to deal with this in a COVID-19 pandemic? She goes on to say, please let me know if you need any more information on that. Another thing that is causing a lot of you to get in touch is the Air New Zealand issue. That is that their crews who are travelling overseas are not subject to the same 14-day mandatory isolation or quarantine when they come back from those duties. Under level 4, they do have to go home after work, stay in their bubble, but they can fly again within the incubation period for the virus, and it's raising a lot of concerns within Air New Zealand from staff who feel that that is not a safe practice. Diane's got in touch to say Air New Zealand is acting in a high-handed manner. I have a friend with family who work for Air New Zealand, and they've been concerned for some time about lax safeguards when crews return to New Zealand. Don't let this go on. It is not good enough for our national carrier to be taking this stance. Air New Zealand, of course, says it is adhering to the Ministry of Health guidelines that say as long as staff present as well, there is not an issue with this. And Nancy's got into touch to say, as an Air New Zealand passenger, I want them to take good care of their staff, passengers, the New Zealand population, and also the people in places they lay over. Of course, use the proper 14-day stand-downs, health checks, quarantine as appropriate, easy access to PPE to protect flight attendants, and step up cleaning procedures of planes. If most COVID-19 cases are Kiwis returning home, mostly by air, all of these crucial precautionary principles should apply. Taxpayers have supported and funded a bailout for Air New Zealand. They have plenty of staff that need work. It is time for Air New Zealand to show leadership and live up to their PR image and walk the talk. Thanks for getting in touch, Nancy. Someone else has said, we have close observation of an Air New Zealand pilot coming home from LA and not in isolation on his own. They go on to say that they move in the local neighbourhood. We're almost out of time to read your feedback. Thank you for so much of you getting in touch this evening. Don't forget, you can catch up with our video stories and all our interviews online. Our news team will keep you up to date overnight. And of course, Morning Report is back with you first thing tomorrow morning, and we'll be back tomorrow night. We'll see you then.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. And an Air New Zealand crew member says the Bluff COVID-19 cluster shows they and the public are put at risk by the lack of quarantine for staff returning from overseas. More than 15,000 people have signed a petition to save the airline Sounds Air after RNZ raised the plight it's facing amid COVID-19. The chief executive of Auckland's City Rail Link is expecting they can get back to work a week after the Level 4 lockdown ends. And an increase in exports at Alert Level 3 could be hampered by a shortage of shipping containers due to the fall off in imports. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7.
Tonight on Nights, Kiwi muso Teresa Bergman sings down the line from Berlin. We've got a window on the world of quarantine cuisine, how the COVID lockdown is forcing all of us to reacquaint ourselves with home-cooked food, and Van